Memory is a country that disappears. It exists for a few generations, 1, 2, maybe 3. Then it starts to go, past the last landmark, into no man's land, disappearing the way that Newfoundland soldiers disappeared beyond what they called the danger tree. When I started work on a book about my mother's family, I came to the archives in Newfoundland. Like most people who come to places like this, I wasn't certain what I was looking for. It's usually families that search for their past, sometimes for amusement, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes because they believe they can discover who they are. It's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle that has more pieces missing with each passing year. Faces disappear, memories go. It's like a kind of no man's land of forgetfulness. And even objects that once were the landmarks of a country's history are tucked away in dusty files and only stumbled upon by chance. I am not a Newfoundlander, but my mother's family, the Goodyears, came from Newfoundland. Her parents were born on a stretch of coast called the Straight Shore. When I was a child, we came here from our home in Ontario for summer holidays. It seemed like another world.
I've laid out the bodies of too many young...
Our king needs more Newfoundland.
No company could
I loved hearing stories in Newfoundland, and I loved the voices, like my grandfather's.
The Goodyears were fishermen, like everyone. Your great-uncle Roland can tell you the history.
The 3 eldest boys were already veterans of a few seasons on the ice.
And like my great-uncle Roland.
Fished, yes, up to the Labrador in the summer, to the ice for seals in March. But father was a good hand with a hammer and saw.
It was my grandfather, Joe Goodyear, who introduced me to the family's history. His 6 brothers, and his sister Kate, his father, Josiah, and his mother, Louisa.
And mother, strict as a straight edge. Worked, raised all of us, helped father.
I'll be happy never to see the ocean again.
Years later, I learned more about my great-grandmother, Louisa Goodyear, in the fantastically disorganized journals Roland left behind.
And then for a few extra pennies, or perhaps for payment in vegetables, which are always a scarce supply, she laid out the town's dead. Washed them, dressed them, sent them on their way.
The house where, on summer holidays, I used to listen to the Goodyear family stories was smaller than I remembered. I was told my great-grandmother was the undertaker. She knew how hard outport life was. She saw its toll. She was the one who convinced my great-grandfather that the family should move.
We'll have nothing here if we stay, nothing.
The spring of 1914 would likely have even...
You would be surprised to know that Grandpa's had...
I've put aside some cash.
But we've everything here.
We'll have nothing here if we stay. Nothing, Josiah. I've given you 6 sons. How many will drown or be frozen on the ice? I've given you a daughter. What will become of Kate here,
Poor Lord North.
in this little place?
There was nothing here.
Grandpa's is our one chance.
Don't worry, Mother.
Leaving for all fishing parties, including Mars, Ocean Park.
Their lives had been run by the rhythms of the sea, but that changed in 1907 when Louisa Goodyear got her way.
It's as simple as that.
They set out for their new life by train. It took them further from the coast and deeper into the interior than they had ever been.
And no company could be in a better situation than ours to capture...
Roland characteristically extolled the interior's riches before the family even got there.
Grand Falls was an unspoiled cataract of monumental splendor. rivaling the world's great...
His brother, Stan, left behind a few broken hearts.
So it's goodbye, my sweet belle, and goodbye to the sea. We'll work in the woods, boys, and...
Brother Headley, in fact, was on his way to Toronto to pursue his studies.
I still can't believe I'll be going.
Oh, Headley, isn't it grand?
Kate, the only daughter, adored her brother Headley. She was as excited by his future as he was.
You'll tell me all the news from Toronto, won't you?
And Louisa still had her hands full with the two youngest boys.
Ken, Ray, get your heads in from that window before you catch your deaths.
They were on their way to Grand Falls, a town established by one man for a single purpose.
Grand Falls didn't exist.
His name was Alfred Harmsworth, but he was known to the world as Lord Northcliffe, the British press baron who sold more newspapers than any man alive. And in 1903, when Northcliffe was looking for a North American source of pulp, he settled on the interior of Newfoundland at a waterfalls on the Exploits River. Northcliffe was part pragmatist, part romantic. It was business that drove him, but he reveled in the adventure of bringing industry and civilization to the heart of England's oldest colony. Almost overnight, the woods of Newfoundland were transformed from wilderness into a new and hopeful sector of the island's struggling economy. Northcliffe was never timid about bold, unorthodox ventures, and Grand Falls did possess a site for a suitably majestic pied-à-terre for his occasional visits. But otherwise, Newfoundland was not an obvious choice. For most people, it was only a coast, nothing more. But for Northcliffe, the interior of the island had two irresistible attractions. White coal, the power Northcliffe needed to drive the turbines of his pulp mill, and size.
The 198-year lease I have negotiated with the government of Newfoundland covers an area of 2,300 square miles of forest, river, and watershed. The holdings of the Anglo-Newfoundland Development Company are as large as the state of Massachusetts. More vast than the counties of Sussex, Surrey, and Kent combined.
But no one, not even Lord Northcliffe, was more dazzled by the interior's possibilities than my great Uncle Roland.
The vast potentialities of this inestimable treasure trove brought fishermen from every outport of the island to the promise of work at the mill and in the lumber camps.
There was nothing backwoods about the industry Northcliffe established. The mill's technology was as advanced as any in the world. 30,000 tons of newsprint were shipped to England in the first year of operation. And 1,000 men, most for the first time in their lives, were earning cash wages. The town itself was no less sudden a creation. It was rigorously and completely planned. It was as if Grand Falls had been plucked fully grown from England and dropped on the shore of the Exploits River. Northcliffe never lacked confidence. He told his workers that the day would soon come when Newfoundland would be one of the world's great paper centers. By 1910, my great-grandfather Josiah had founded J. Goodyear and Sons. The family company took on logging contracts, hauled freight, ran a taxi service, and operated the town hearse. The company opened its own stores. Josiah imagined that one day his 6 sons would all be his vice presidents.
You will be surprised to know that Grand Falls...
The future role of Kate, his only daughter and probably the smartest of the lot, was less clear.
The Goodyear sons would have gone.
The oldest son was Roland.
And although to me fell the weighty responsibilities of the eldest child, it was brother Stan who by fortuitous circumstances acquired the family stables. Father was the head of the company, but it was mother whose ambition drove the family's aspirations.
No more storms at sea, no more ice floes adrift, and that suits me fine.
For my great-grandmother, Grand Falls represented peace, prosperity, and security.
I've laid out the bodies of too many young men in my day. I'll be happy never to see the ocean again.
But she had no idea that when Northcliffe chose Newfoundland, peace was the last thing on his mind. He believed that war was imminent in Europe, and he wanted another source for the paper on which his business relied. In Grand Falls, the threat of a European war seemed far away. The town was prospering, and danger, so my great-aunt Kate thought, was something the Goodyears had left behind.
Dearest Headley, you will be surprised to know that Grand Falls has become so established a metropolis. Of course, the temptations of Toronto and the rigors of your studies have eradicated us from your memory. Mother sends young Ray for the post every day, and he comes back quite disgruntled if there is nothing from you. Do write and tell us how you are.
The family was safe in Grand Falls from the hardships of outport life. Hardships, so Roland noted in his journals, that had never been more clear than in the spring of 1914.
Newfoundland's bountiful annual seal hunt employed thousands of men on hundreds of vessels. In good years, it brought in as many as 700,000 pelts to the merchants' wharves at St. John's. The seal hunt was a chance for an outport lad to test his mettle, and had the family not moved, the Goodyear sons would have gone that year. The 3 eldest boys were already veterans of a few seasons on the ice. The spring of 1914 would likely have even seen young Kane and Ray with their first births. And the spring of 1914 proved to be a hunt like no other.
The story is one of the saddest told in Newfoundland. How a sealing crew set out from one ship to another, and how, when a storm blew into the ice pack that night, the captains each assumed that the crew was safe on the other ship. There was no radio communication between the two. The ship's owners had decided the wages of wireless operators would be an unnecessary expense. That spring, my great-aunt Kate wrote to Headley in Toronto.
Dearest Headley, You will by now have heard the terrible news. Here, people talk of nothing else. A crew was trapped on the ice, and 77 men perished in that dreadful storm. In St. John's, crowds gathered to await the ship's return. It is difficult to imagine the sadness that has befallen so many families of our islands. You will recognize many of the names: William Pear, Benjamin March, Alfred Dowden, Edward Tippett, and his 3 sons, Norman, Abel, and William. The terrible list goes on and on.
Newfoundland had never known such a tragedy. No one could have guessed that soon there was worse, much worse, to come. Among the ships that brought back the 77 frozen bodies from the ice was the Florizel. She was the same ship that took the first contingent of Newfoundland soldiers overseas to the Great War 7 months later. Newfoundland raised its own regiment, and the first contingent embarked for England in October 1914. For a place the size of Newfoundland, to dress, arm, feed, and pay its own soldiers was a costly and ambitious undertaking. But it was a source of great pride to the island, proof that Newfoundland was a country. Or so the men said. The women weren't so sure. It was hard not to get caught up in the excitement of preparation. The mood was festive. It felt almost like a football match, our team off to play against theirs. And the departures were full of cheers and smiles and assurances that it would not last very long. It was a way to see the world, a chance for a lad to test his mettle, and there were hundreds of sons like the Goodyear boys who did their best to comfort hundreds of mothers like Louisa.
It's just a bit of adventure, Mother.
Before the Great War was over, all the Goodyear boys except Roland enlisted. People said that my great-grandmother was a hard woman. They said that they never saw her cry, but they couldn't have known what fear she held inside.
Oh, my sons, oh, my precious boys.
The Newfoundlanders trained in England, and although they wore their own regimental insignia, they had not quite escaped their colonial past. It was one thing to have Newfoundlanders in the ranks, quite another when it came to who was in charge.
0500 Ellsworth Valley, 0530 inspection, 0600 parade drill, 0700 breakfast, 0800 lecture, and you will remember your notebook, Goodyear, for a change. 0900...
I think he likes you, Stan.
The pommy prig.
Goodyear?
Sir, our esteemed commanding officer is a chap named Haddo. He is not much impressed with his Newfoundlanders. The sentiments are mutual.
I command the Newfoundlanders, and they know it not have. I'll make them, I'll break them, I'll make the fighter sweat. For I'm Haddo, some laddo, I'll be general yet.
Canadians, are we?
Newfoundlanders, and you'll soon wish we weren't.
Oh, Newfoundlanders, do forgive us, old. Cod liver oil, seal blubber. That's your line, isn't it?
You lolly bastard.
I'm Haddo, some laddo, I'm just off the staff. I command the Newfoundlanders, and they know it a half. I'll make them, I'll break them, I'll make them fight.
The war pictures I saw as a child always puzzled me. I was always told they were pictures of Newfoundland soldiers. I remember asking my grandfather, wasn't Newfoundland always part of Canada?
A country, my son, not a province, a country. Always was, always will be. A country we fought and died for. And don't you forget it.
Newfoundland's great moment of national pride came on July the 1st, 1916, near a French village called Beaumont-Hamel, not far from the River Somme. There was a landmark there that the Newfoundlanders called the Danger Tree. It marked the beginning of no man's land. That morning, in the first half hour of battle, most of the 600 Newfoundlanders who went over the top died before they reached it. And from that day on, July the 1st became Memorial Day, the day that Newfoundland remembered what it was. In the stories my grandfather told me, Ray Goodyear tried twice to enlist. He was the youngest. He was underage, and twice he was caught and sent home. But one night he hid at the back of the Grand Falls Town Hall when his own father was giving a recruitment speech.
Our king needs more Newfoundlanders. It's as simple as that. So if age or poor health prevents us from going too, we still have our duty here. We can't keep the young lads back.
The crowd turned when Ray stood up on a chair at the back of the hall.
Father, now can I go?
Young Ray Goodyear was called up quickly to the front lines in France. He met the regiment where it was dug in near the village of Goodyear in 1916. The only landscape he'd ever seen that looked anything like this was in Newfoundland after a forest fire. Family stories can only be pieced together with the bits of history that survive forgetfulness. You can find clues, a dead tree, an old picture, dates on a memorial, but you can't ever know what really happened. You can only guess. By the standards of the First World War, the advance at Goodyear was something of a success. A few of the Newfoundland soldiers actually reached the enemy trenches. But not Ray Goodyear. He was hit by shrapnel. He was cut open as deeply as if he had run into the full swing of an axe. Northcliffe's prediction had proven correct. The routes to the forests of northern Europe were cut by the war. His newspapers depended on Newfoundland pulp. And with the endless drama of the war unfolding, they were selling like never before. But the war of gallant charges and brave defense that the newspapers described was not the war the soldiers such as Stan Goodyear knew. Beyond the patriotic headlines, the war had become a nightmare of mud and death. Gas blinded its victims. Flamethrowers turned faces into featureless masses of flesh. Shells ripped away ears and arms and legs. It was a war that would have to be left to the poets to describe. Newspapers were neither angry nor clear-sighted enough to report such horror. Even in the midst of the war, with one of his brothers already dead, the economic future of the Goodyears looked promising to Roland.
It is my prediction that the end of the war will unleash a veritable boom. And no company could be in a better situation than ours to capitalize on what will surely be a bonanza.
It was his brother Stan on whom Roland pinned most of his hopes for the company. Stan never lacked for bravado. In France, he won drinks by betting he could lift a horse. He embodied the best qualities of the family, and by Roland's never immodest extension of Newfoundland. Stan, everybody said, had always been lucky. Stan had been with the regiment from the beginning of the war. He was in transport, and at the Somme, across France, and toward Flanders, he hauled food and supplies and ammunition. At times, transport seemed the Great War's only movement. By the fall of 1917, when Stan's unit dug in near a place called Passchendaele, the fronts were paralyzed. Both sides were held in check with endless artillery barrages. Ammunition ran low. Stan Goodyear volunteered to return to a depot hidden behind the lines.
So it's goodbye, my sweet belle, and goodbye to the sea. We'll work in the woods, boys, and bring home.
His luck had run out. It was a direct hit. And afterwards, the men said they couldn't tell what bits were the horse and what had been Stan Goodyear. Soon it was the dead who loomed over the Goodyear family. There was no escaping them. First Ray, then Stan. By then, Kate was in Ottawa training to be a nurse.
Dear Mother and Father, I received your letter today. How much more sadness can one war bring? How much more will you have to bear?
I do not doubt my identity as a Newfoundlander.
Hedley was attending the University of Toronto. He was the scholar of the family. His sister, Kate, thought he was destined to be a statesman.
And I cannot turn a blind eye to Newfoundland's poverty, its economic stagnation, its backward educational system.
Hedley believed that Newfoundland's future lay in confederation with Canada, an opinion directly opposed to my grandfather's.
A country, my son, always was, always will be. In this house, anyway.
But like so many things in those days, their differences were never resolved. The war intervened. In Toronto, Hedley enlisted with the Canadians. In May of 1917, he embarked for England. Early in 1918, he was in France. By that spring, the war's dead were numbered in the millions. A few hundred yards of mud had changed hands a dozen times in 4 years, and on both sides, disease and exhaustion were draining morale. By now, German lines had extended beyond easy reach of their own supplies, and the Allies somehow found the strength to believe that a final push might exploit the weaknesses of the German position. On the eve of the Battle of Amiens, Hedley Goodyear wrote a letter home.
Dearest Mother, this is the evening before the attack, and my thoughts are with you all at home. But my backward glance is only wistful because of memories, and because of the sorrow that would further darken your lives, should anything befall me in tomorrow's fray. My eye is fixed on tomorrow with hope for mankind and with visions of a new world.
On July the 1st in Newfoundland, little girls sold forget-me-nots. And at Memorial Day services, Hedley Goodyear's letter is often read.
A blow will be struck tomorrow which will definitely mark the turn of the tide. I shall strike a blow for freedom, along with thousands of others who count personal safety as nothing when freedom is at stake.
Hedley Goodyear survived the Battle of Amiens, and as late summer turned to fall, it seemed he might survive the war. But there is an old superstition. It dogged the Goodyear family. People say that misfortune comes in 1, 2, He was the third, and Hedley's sister Kate lived for 7 decades beyond his death. She was never able to mention his name without crying.
Private A. Folks. Private H. Frampton.
At the first Memorial Day service after the war, my great-grandmother was asked to read out the names of Grand Fall's dead.
Captain H. J. Goodyear.
She did,
Military Cross.
and her voice never wavered.
Lieutenant Corporal O. R. Goodyear. Lieutenant S. C. Goodyear. Military Cross. Corporal G. Gowdy. Sergeant M. Grace. Private W. Han.
Less than 2 months after a sniper blew Hedley Goodyear's skull to pieces, the war ended. No one knew anymore what had been won, and no one could imagine what price had been paid. Still, there were cheers and there were flags, and the boys who were alive and had legs to march on came home. By the time the war was over, everything had changed for the Goodyear family. The 3 dead sons left behind an emptiness that steadily compounded itself over the years. The same was true of Newfoundland. Its losses were greater than anyone had dreamed. Something was gone from the heart of it. In the years after the war, Newfoundland struggled to carry the costs of its great moment of nationalism. The price of its war effort proved almost as staggering as its losses had been. Its national debt increased steadily, and the poverty that Hedley Goodyear had so hated became even worse. Then, in 1929, 2 weeks after the Wall Street crash, a strange thing happened. A tidal wave smashed into Newfoundland's south shore. It was the perfect symbol for what was yet to come. Newfoundland's role in the Great War, its sacrifice of lives and resources, led from what had once been the glorious proof that it was a country, to bankruptcy, to the colony's abandonment by England, and finally to Confederation with Canada. Before 1929, Newfoundland's war debts were already crippling the economy. But after the crash in St. John's and around the coast, the depression was almost more than the island could bear. Less than 20 years after they lined the streets to cheer off the troops, citizens lined up for handouts of potatoes. It seemed as if Newfoundland, once proud and strong enough to raise its own regiment for the Great War, had lost its way. And as the Depression wore on, the fervor of patriotism and independence gave way to reality. The crisis deepened. Not even another war was able to resolve it.
We drifted. We went bankrupt. And consequently, our pensions were cut.
And in those uncertain times, the voices of nationalism and those that proposed Confederation with Canada came close to splitting the island in two.
Confederation is the best thing for us. Now, the essence of the big
By 1948, when a referendum was called, there were brothers and sisters who would not speak to one another, and friends who no longer said hello.
This is part of a callous and deliberately planned campaign.
Definitely untrue.
The campaign was bitter and divisive.
You've got to get a chance to understand the history of this island. It's an unbroken story of struggle. Our people...
Confederates, taking the same position Hedley Goodyear had taken more than 30 years before, argued with facts and figures for the island's future.
And has continued to this very day.
We, the people of Newfoundland, are told in effect.
Nationalists, like my grandfather, based their position less on economic reality than on a passionate refusal to forget their country's past.
That we should scuttle the ship of Newfoundland and be towed, as it were, in a...
Half the population waited to see if their future would hold more promise, while the other half waited to see if the country they had fought for would survive.
The choice is up to you. The people...
Today, in an historic vote of 51% to 49%, Newfoundlanders have decided to join the Canadian family. Joseph Smallwood, the victorious leader of the Confederate forces, pays a visit to the wild celebrations.
With the scratch of pen on paper, everything changed. It was a decision my grandfather would never forgive.
Oh, my poor country.
The Newfoundland he knew disappeared overnight. He was afraid its past would go too.
anniversary of the Battle of Beaumont Hamel was never a day of celebration for my grandfather. It was a day to remember a war, and after the referendum, to remember a country that had slipped away. What my grandfather always marked as Newfoundland's great moment of national pride came just after 9 in the morning on July the 1st, 1916.
2 companies made their way down a slight slope and over the rows of trenches. Along the way, they had to squeeze through the gaps that had been cut in their own barbed wire. It seemed at first as if the advance was proceeding, but the Germans were holding their heaviest fire. They had already fixed their targets. Their machine guns were trained on the narrow gaps in the wire. The regiment's numbers diminished at each of the 4 tangled rows. Few made it past. The ones who did came through the last line of wire and found themselves only as far forward as a single dead tree. It was an old apple tree left from the orchard that had once been there. Somehow it had survived the barrages, and it rose like a skeleton from the lip of a shell hole. It marked the beginning of no man's land. The Newfoundlanders called it the danger tree. By coincidence, Canada's national holiday and Newfoundland's Memorial Day, the day it remembers the Battle of Beaumont Hamel, fall on the same date, July the 1st. It's a coincidence that has always troubled me, a Canadian, the grandson of a Newfoundlander who wanted nothing to do with Canada. It was a conflict I could feel inside me, my own present feuding with a faraway past, and I always thought I'd like to write about it before it disappeared. There is a story that is one of the family's most cherished. It is probably the first of the Goodyear stories that I ever heard. Aunt Kate trained at St. Luke's in Ottawa at a time when the returning wounded were straining the hospital's resources. Beds were juggled, elective surgery was postponed, patients were discharged at the earliest possible moment. But finally, on a glorious autumn day, one young soldier was wheeled from ward to ward, and with every bed occupied and no patient ready for release, he was left between a swinging double doorway and a beige wall on the second-floor corridor. He was a private from Northern Ontario. He had tousled blonde hair and a strong, wide grin. He was 19 and often reached forward and touched the flat side of his bed covers as if not quite willing to believe that his leg was no longer there. The hospital's private rooms were on the 3rd floor. Apparently, no one thought it unusual that a few of them should be empty, with so crowded a ward on the floor below. No one, that is, except Kate Goodyear. She had the young soldier moved that night, and he slept more soundly than he had in months. The next morning, the head of nurses and the hospital superintendent were both furious. Kate was called before them. She squared herself in front of them. "I have brothers overseas," she said. "I don't know where or how they are, and I can't do much to help them. But I'll do whatever I can, wherever I am, and I'd like to think that someone might do the same for them." "So," she said, and her eyes gleamed. Her voice became suddenly stern. "So let me tell you, as long as I am in this hospital, and so long as there's an empty bed, no soldier will ever spend a night in the hallway. I will not have it." It was the irrefutable force of her emotion that won the day. A woman's combination of anger and compassion that is as potent and necessary now as it was 75 years ago. The head of nurses and the superintendent were apparently transformed by its fury. They were speechless. They glanced at one another. They mumbled. They were made to see that a modern war was not a temporary aberration. It was no mere interruption of what had existed before the war had been declared. It was a catastrophe. The young soldier was allowed to stay where he was. By the time I came to piece together what I could of the Goodyear story, the only person left alive from that generation of the family was my grandmother. But by then she was an old woman, in bed, in an old folks' home, and her memory, like so many of the memories I would try to find, had disappeared. Before I came to Newfoundland with my questions about the family, she started to go somewhere we couldn't imagine. As she went, her landscape became steadily more barren. Faces disappeared, names were forgotten, and finally she passed the last landmark on her horizon and found herself in no man's land. It's an impossible search, to come to a place in the present and think that it will reveal to you its past. It's like trying to return to a country that might have been. It's as difficult as imagining a war when you've never experienced one, or knowing about growing old and forgetting everything. Still, there's always the hope that if only you get beyond the last impossible landmark, you might learn something about who you are.